The trauma response. In this video, I talk about how the body responds to trauma in real time. Today, I want to talk about the trauma response, or what some researchers call the defense cascade. It's basically how our bodies and the bodies of all animals respond to stress and trauma. The trauma response is how every advanced animal on Earth deals with trauma. Even you. The trauma response is a natural progression of physiological or body-based events that happen without thought. It is a part of evolution and is how prey animals were able to survive even the most brutal attacks. These are adaptive responses, which means they are not pathological. They were designed to maximize the survival of prey animals during intolerable situations. We humans are not exempt from this ancient trauma response. We go through it too, and it is how we learned how to survive events that not everyone survives. It only becomes problematic when your mind and body use these responses for everything, even things that are not directly traumatic. All trauma survivors have a default mechanism of responding to life events as though the trauma has never left us. For our bodies after trauma, it hasn't left. We respond as though the war or trauma is not over or could happen at any time. The reason we call the trauma response the defense cascade is because it is a series of defensive responses that literally cascade from one response or phase to another when exposed to any type of traumatic event. The trauma response is basically an activation of one or both parts of the autonomic nervous system. There are two basic parts of this subconscious part of your nervous system. The purpose of these two parts of the nervous system is to regulate organs of your body independent of conscious thought. These are things like your respiration, your heart rate, your gastrointestinal tract, your muscles, your pupils, your blood pressure, all the things you don't really think of. The two parts are the sympathetic or fight or flight branch and the parasympathetic or rest and digest branch. The fight or flight branch happens when you want to fight or flee some kind of a predator. The rest and digest branch is when you feel comfortable, rested, and ready to relax and digest your food. In trauma patients, however, activation of the parasympathetic nervous system is not always a rest and digest experience, but can be an abnormal trauma response. So what happens when the sympathetic nervous system gets activated? Your heart rate increases. Your bronchial passages open. The digestive tract slows down because blood is shunted away from it in order to feed the muscles. The other areas of the body will have constricted blood vessels, while the muscles will have more blood supply in order to fight or flee a predator. The esophagus and the stomach will shut down. The pupils will dilate. You'll get goosebumps. You'll sweat. The blood pressure will raise. You'll have a dry mouth. It's all the typical responses you think of when you are afraid or when you have a fight or flight response. So when your sympathetic nervous system gets activated, your body becomes ready to be able to fight the threat or predator, or your body gets ready to run away or flee from the threat. This is why it's called the fight or flight system. Under normal circumstances, activation of the parasympathetic nervous system means you'll have increased salivation. Your heart rate will slow down. Your blood pressure will decrease. Tears can come. Your digestion will be stimulated and you will have the possibility of defecation. Your urination is able to happen. It promotes better blood flow to the genitals during sex and narrows your pupils. The bronchial tree can constrict. This is what you see in healthy people using the part of their parasympathetic nervous system ideal for the rest and digestion in the absence of a stressor. It can be a pathological response in the trauma patient, however. You can learn a lot about the defense cascade or the trauma response from watching a gazelle being attacked by a lion. These poor animals go through the entirety of the trauma response, beginning when they perk up their ears and sense from their environment that something is wrong. This is the beginning of the trauma response, but sadly, it is not often where the responses end. Let's see how this works. Phase 1 is called arousal. This is the first step in activating some sort of a defense against a predator. In animals, you'll see their ears perk up. The animal senses danger and mobilizes the sympathetic nervous system and the motor or muscle system. In humans, salivation will stop, and you'll notice your voice will become more high-pitched. Your muscle tone will be higher, and both your heart rate and breath rate will go up. This is a state of preparedness for potential danger ahead. If you're the kind of person who gets stuck in a state of arousal after the experience of a traumatic event, you might feel panicky much of the time. You notice your heart races, you hyperventilate, you might sleep poorly. You might feel like you have muscle tension and irritability. You might notice indigestion or have poor eating habits. You can stammer. You can have frequent episodes of sweating. All of these are signs that you are stuck in a state of arousal. In phase 2, your fight or flight response gets activated completely. This is basically the activation of your sympathetic nervous system. In animals, their muscle becomes tense. The animal might snarl or growl at an enemy. Their adrenaline kicks in from the adrenal glands. You might notice a rapid heart rate, fast breathing rate, dilated pupils, and an opening of the bronchial tree. Again, blood is shunted away from the GI tract in order to supply more blood to the muscles so that the animal can fight or flee. If you're a person who has become stuck in a fight or flight response, you might have episodes of panic, nervousness, or anger. You might feel like you want to run away or fight anyone who gets in your way. The pain signals of your body to the brain get blocked, so you might feel a decreased sensation of pain. It's not the same thing as having a flashback, but happens when you have learned to see the world as threatening. Exposure to abuse and trauma often means seeing minor stressors as being much more serious than they really are. Trauma survivors with this problem are quick to feel overwhelmed by rage or the need to escape when faced with a reminder of their traumatic experience from the past. Phase 3 is called the freeze response. You'll see this in deer who freeze on the highway when a car approaches. In animals, the animal will remain immobile in order to avoid being detected by the predator. This is helpful to the animal because a lot of predators want movement. If they do not see movement or sense that their prey is dead, they often stop and leave them alone. This animal is always prepared to drop the freeze response in favor of the fight or flight response instead. Freezing is the same thing as having the fight or flight response activated with the parasympathetic brake applied at the same time. Think of it as the gas to the car applied at the same time as the brakes. You can see how the car would be stopped, but the gas is still running. You'll notice high muscle tone, rapid heart rate, decreased GI activities, and pupils dilated, just as though the person is in a fight or flight response, except that they're frozen. In some cases, the heart rate can drop suddenly in what's called fear bradycardia. It's very common to be stuck in the freeze response. It's common in victims of rape, fires, and other fear-provoking situations. They often feel immobilized, even as their minds experience a sensation of fear. They feel hypervigilant, but in some cases the heart rate will drop. Because we are humans and animals at the same time, there can be frequent thoughts of shame and guilt by the trauma survivor, who often feels they should have done more. These trauma survivors don't understand that their response was so reflexive they may not have had conscious control over it. As the trauma progresses, the animal can enter phase 4, called the Tonic Immobility Response. This is a terminal or end-stage defense strategy that can happen after the prey animal has been caught by the predator. The fight or flight response and the freeze response have already failed, so the prey animal's only defense is to try to deactivate the killing reflex in their predator. The predator might lose interest and may walk away, saving the life of the prey animal. This is called faking death. The animal's muscles will be rigid but moldable, their eyes are open, their gaze will be fixed and unfocused. This is when the parasympathetic nervous system is most dominant. The heart rate decreases and abnormal heart rhythms can occur. The body temperature, blood pressure, and respirations decrease. Human trauma survivors can also have tonic immobility. This is particularly common during sexual assaults when the woman experiences what is called rape-induced paralysis. It It can also be seen in shell shock, when the soldier cannot call out even if he wants to. They describe being immobile, feeling cold or numb, and feeling typical dissociative psychological symptoms. The sympathetic nervous system has failed, leaving behind the overwhelming sense of being trapped in an inescapable or futile situation that is largely hopeless. The memory systems remain active, so the person remembers it vividly. They just can't do anything about their trauma at the time. The survivor can often feel a complete lack of fear as they simply watch themselves being hurt. The final phase in the defense cascade is called collapsed immobility. It is more commonly seen in humans, probably because we live our lives mostly in the upright position. It is seen in things like vasovagal syncope, fainting, or fear-induced fainting, such as fainting at the sight of blood. It can happen when a threat is overwhelming and inescapable. Your heart rate and blood pressure will drop dramatically, so you might even collapse. Blood flow to the brain drops to very low levels, which can make the situation worse. Your muscle tone will drop, and you may lose consciousness. So you can see how you may progress through the different phases in trauma. A traumatized person can start out with the classic stress-related symptoms associated with fear, such as rapid heart rate, sweating, and the perception of fear. After a period of time, however, this gives way to a loss of the sympathetic nervous system activity, leaving behind the parasympathetic response to the trauma. The victim can have a sudden loss of consciousness and body jerking that look like seizures. There can be a lack of fear and paleness. Bowel and bladder incontinence can also happen. This is the end stage of the trauma response, when the situation has become overwhelming and inescapable, and when all of the normal mechanisms such as the fight or flight response, tonic immobility, and other responses just fail and you simply collapse. I want to talk about the trauma response and how a single traumatic event can trigger a traumatic response in the body that can affect the body for years afterwards. The example I'm going to give is my daughter Sarah. My daughter Sarah was born 27 years ago. Everything was fine until the last hour or so before she was born. I could see evidence on the fetal monitor that there was some distress going on. Things didn't look right. Her heart rate was dropping. It dropped lower and lower until it was in the 60s and stayed there. This is horrible for a baby. Their heart rate should be at least 100, 120 at least. It was clear she wasn't getting enough oxygen and that she was dying. The doctor scheduled me for an emergency cesarean section, but fortunately I was able to deliver her naturally within just a few minutes. This saved her life. They resuscitated her, and she was okay. Later, though, you could tell something wasn't quite right. She was a very anxious baby. She clung to me. She didn't want to crawl very much. She didn't want to walk very much. Not because she couldn't. She was scared. She didn't want to. She did, though. And she got better, and she became more independent. But it took a long, long time. Years. Much longer than the average child. She did eventually grow up, become a mother, become a good student, and a hard worker. But she's still affected by her trauma. When she least expects it, let's say someone cuts her off in traffic or says something bad about a job she did, she becomes anxious, really upset, more than the average person. Her heart races sometimes. She breathes fast. She gets panic attacks. She sweats all the time when this happens. It's as though she's having an overreaction to what the average person might not think is traumatic at all. This is because even though she doesn't remember her trauma, her body does. I call it her default mechanism. It's the mechanism her body goes to whenever it's reminded of her stress and her trauma. She experiences the trauma in today's time, processes it as though it was possibly the same thing as the trauma she experienced at birth, and she reacts accordingly. She can't help it. If there's a take-home message to this video, it's that trauma is complicated. Trauma is not just a psychological response to a traumatic event, even though we often only think about the thoughts and feelings associated with the traumatic experiences. We are humans, so we would like to think that we are far more complex than other animals in the animal kingdom, which is only partly true. Many aspects of the trauma experience are not much different from those things experienced by animals. Biological mechanisms in humans are a big part of the trauma experience. The different manifestations of trauma-related disorders can be explained by the defense cascade. In other videos, I'll talk a lot about tips you can use to heal from trauma. Notice that you will have different trauma-based scripts for different situations in your life. These trauma-based scripts you use will partly determine your response to the environment around you. Your response to stressors will depend on your default mechanism. Recognize when you are in one phase or another, or using one default mechanism or another. Learn to teach your body to correct this outdated and scripted response. This takes time and effort, but it is possible to train your body to respond in different ways to everyday stressors that remind you of your trauma. Thanks for sticking it out through this video. The war is over. We'll talk more later about how to heal from trauma. Bye.